This morning we'll start with a short film by Kimiko Marr. She is a filmmaker who has, after working in television for a great many years, has been making various kinds of documentary films about the Japanese American incarceration from World War II. And this morning's film it's a short titled Emily Light, A Light in the Darkness. It is a story about a white school teacher who taught at Tula Lake, Jerome and Topaz, and but told from the perspective of her Japanese American students. And so we'll screen that short documentary, and then have Kimiko come up and talk about the film briefly. Then have Professor Scott Kurashige from the University of Washington come and talk about multiracial solidarity in Little Tokyo and Bronzeville. He's written many books about especially interracial relations between African American and Japanese American communities, and he's going to, I think, give us a fantastic presentation this morning as well. And after that presentation's over, we'll ask Kimiko Marr and Scott Kurashige to come up to the front and engage with us and take questions and have some discussion.
On February 19, 1942, just 2 months after the United States entered World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which paved the way for the mass evacuation and eventual incarceration of all persons of Japanese descent from the western coast of the United States.
The time, spring and summer of 1942. The place, 10 different relocation centers in unsettled parts of California, Arizona, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, and Arkansas.
Approximately 40% of the initial 110,000 people incarcerated were American-born children 19 years and younger.
When the school bell rings, it's a signal for these students at Hart Mountain in Wyoming to change classes. The school curriculum meets the standard of the state where the center is located. Mathematics, American history, geography, the fundamentals of an American education. This is a class in mathematics. And a rhythm class of 5th grade pupils. In the modern school, many subjects are added to reading, writing, and arithmetic as part of the schoolwork. Some of the teachers are Caucasian. Some are evacuees, Americans of Japanese ancestry.
38-year-old Emily Light was one of those Caucasian teachers. Emily Underhill Light, a New Jersey native, taught elementary school until she came to California in 1941 to study social theory at UC Berkeley. While at Berkeley, she lived at International House, where she made many Japanese American friends. Perhaps that was what inspired her to volunteer to teach in the relocation centers. Her first stop was Tule Lake in Northern California. She arrived in early September 1942 to set up barrack number 123 as a makeshift schoolroom in preparation for the first day of school, September 14th. Lawrence Higashihara was one of her first grade students.
Well, you know, I started first grade and I wasn't too comfortable. I didn't want to go to school. Well, I was really scared, so I cried and cried and cried. So my mom brought me to school and we sat on the step, you know, and the step was nothing, just a couple of boxes like. So we sat there for maybe 4 hours, and the teacher, I don't know, Emily liked that teacher, she spent some times with the kid and spent most of the time with me. I don't know how she got away with that because she had 20, 30 other kids, you know. Finally, my mom went home and Emily, the teacher, told my mom she could leave, so I stayed with her, but I still can speak English. But I used to spend, I think, I say half the time in the bathroom, but maybe not that much. Maybe only 25% of the time. But I spent a lot of time in the bathroom because I didn't have any friends. I didn't have nobody. I didn't know what the teacher was telling me. All the kids spoke English. The only guy that didn't speak English was Larry. And like I said, I had dyslexia, so I had a learning impairment, so I had really a lot of problems. That loyalty deal with my dad did, he said that we were going to stay in the United States, so we got sent to Arkansas. So Miss Light, Emily, told my dad, says, yeah, he's having a lot of trouble, but I remember her talking to him, so I misunderstood English a little bit by the end of the picture. She said, oh, Edison had a lot of trouble, but his mom taught him and he did okay, you know, after a while. So my dad said, okay. So he went, and I'm sorry I can't go to the next camp. I would like to, but I can't. So we went to Arkansas, and then that's when I got that teacher. She was awful. Then we used to have a teacher's aide, you know. And she talks to me in Japanese every time the teacher asks a question. I didn't understand very well, so she would translate it in Japanese and tell me. And the teacher got mad at her because she thought that she was siding with me and not her, so she didn't let that girl talk to me at all anymore, so don't talk to him. And every time she has a question, she asks me first. Then she beat me up every time, and so I cried all day long. So I told my mother I didn't want to go to school, but she made me go to school. But beside that, you know, I didn't have no friends the first half a year, so from September till December, I didn't have no friend. Recess, I used to walk out and stand in the corner of the building and look around like that. Nobody talked to me. The teacher don't talk to me because she's always mad at me. But you know, in the middle of the year, let me tell you something, like a miracle. My first grade teacher, she somehow sensed that I was having trouble, and she came and looked for me and got that teacher kicked out. Amazing. So then what happened is she takes over, then everybody likes me. So I'm everybody's best friend because everybody knew I was a teacher's pet. So the next half year were really probably the best in school in my whole life. So this teacher was so nice. We used to go like the Japanese, you know, they say otete, they hang on together and they get a big line and go dancing and skipping to go see the teacher. She was so nice. It was really great.
My going to Tule Lake had anguished my mother unwittingly. She feared for my safety, feared political intrigue, and my getting caught up in it. No amount of writing has assuaged these fears, so I decided to use my leave to talk to her and my family to help them better understand the situation. My mother went with me when I spoke in our church where many sharp, critical questions were asked. I felt, with the facts, I'd answered them well and could see attitudes changing, as well as the last vestige of doubt leaving my mother. As we walked home under a beautiful starlit sky, she remarked sadly, and I thought you were against our country.
I don't know, I've always thought about her over the years, and I'm sorry I never met her again. Real sorry. But, in a way, I would have liked to seen her after I did okay, So if I could have seen her back in the 80s, I would have been real happy. But what's so sad was she was living right here in El Cerrito, and my sister lives in El Cerrito today. Yeah, and that's the sad part. But I don't know. Maybe the hereafter, maybe I'll see her again.
Emily never married or had children of her own, so she retired to North Carolina to be closer to her brother and sister. She passed away in 1991 at the age of 85.
Kimiko's she has several short documentaries about the World War II Japanese American experience, and I think at the end you saw that the Hapayonse project, which she is the founder of. And I should also mention that I think she's one of the lead organizers of the Jerome Rower pilgrimage to Arkansas, and is also the founder of the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages project. And so I wanted to invite her to come and talk a little bit about that work, and of course the films that she's done, and most particularly about this film and how it came to her to make this kind of short documentary. So please help me welcome Kimiko Marr.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I didn't really prepare anything specific, so forgive me if I start rambling. I can talk about what inspired me to do this work in the first place. It was really my grandparents. If you remember the scene where Larry's talking and he has a name tag on and it's kind of loud in the background, that was actually at my grandmother's celebration of life. And when my grandmother, my last living grandparent, passed away, that's when it really motivated me to try to do something about the history, the Japanese American history, the incarceration history. And I brought a camera guy and we started interviewing just family friends. Larry was a family friend. And he starts talking about this teacher. And when I first started talking to him, that very first interview, he couldn't remember her name, but he remembered he was like, it was, Emily, Edith, something like that. And so I immediately went home and I Googled her, and she had a scrapbook. A woman named Pat Fitzpatrick had found Emily's scrapbook. I don't know if it was at a rummage sale or if it was an estate sale, or somehow she rescued this book and her daughter digitized it and put it up online. And so I was able to look and see all of these pictures and these notes that Emily had written about her time teaching in camp. And then of course I saw Larry's name as one of her students. So I immediately had to interview him again. In the meantime, after I told him what her name was and some information about her and that she was already deceased, he went, the last scene there is from a website that you can look at people's graves, you can look up people's grave sites. And he left that digital thing saying, "To my favorite teacher, Lawrence Higashihara with the little flower." He did that. I didn't even know. I just stumbled upon that. And then he actually printed that picture that he's holding of her. He printed that from the website and blew it up and has it on his desk. That's how much this woman meant to him. So this was the first short documentary I ever did. And it inspired me to interview more people and to hear more stories, not necessarily stories specifically of allyship, but just stories about, Japanese American incarceration. And then it led to me being invited to go to my first pilgrimage in Minidoka, and then I became obsessed with pilgrimages after that. And then I put on my first pilgrimage myself this year to Jerome Rower, which some people here in the audience were at and already saw this film. And that's when I became interested in doing a project on pilgrimage. And so my current project, which we just received a National Park Service grant for, is to do a website that will have information for all of the pilgrimages and then recorded oral histories like this one with Larry, but we record them at the actual site. And that's pretty much what I've been working on. So.
So Kimiko will take questions in the Q&A section along with Scott in a moment. And now I want to shift over. So this session is about kind of thinking about Japanese Americans and race relations. So obviously one major dimension of this is thinking about what is the Japanese American relationship to white America. But I think it's also equally compelling to investigate what was Japanese American race relationship with Black America, with other Asian American groups. And so Scott Kurashige used to be at University of Michigan, now at University of Washington, is I think one of the foremost experts in the country who deals with Japanese American or Asian American and Black relations. He has 2 books out on the city of Detroit, and a really interesting book about that he wrote with Grace Lee Boggs about sustainable activism. But his very initial book that I remember reading, The Shifting Grounds of Race, Blacks and Japanese Americans in the Making of Multi-Ethnic Los Angeles, I think continues today to be really important work. And so I'm going to ask Scott to come up and share with us some of his research on these important race relation questions. Thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you, Professor Williams, for that generous introduction. I really want to thank the Ito Center and Janum for hosting this important event. And a special thanks to Shannon and Cortland for just helping me be here, make it possible for me to be here. So I'm going to talk about World War II, when Little Tokyo became known as Bronzeville to some. And there's a lot of really, really interesting historical research that's been done on this topic, by others than me, since I first took it up. And it's been interesting to think about the book that I wrote, which does address some of this history, that's now over 10 years old. And I've been trying to think about what it means when I started working on it in the 90s, what it meant when it came out, 2007, 2008, and what it means today. And I'm going to start by talking about a historical moment when there was a political leader who used the media to whip up racist fears and hatred, and how that had some really significant impact and a really damaging impact, obviously, on a lot of people too. So the person I'm going to talk about first is Fletcher Boren, who was the mayor of Los Angeles. He had a really long run, 1938 to 53. So think about someone, people may not like having them in office, but then they keep getting reelected over and over and over again, and they're there quite a long time. Fletcher Boren was a Republican, but he was actually known as a liberal Republican. He supported the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, and he had been a judge and a civil libertarian, and he sort of came to office on a good government platform to clean up corruption. And it was really fascinating for me to find all these records that he left behind at the Huntington Library. So I spent a number of hours in there. And so when Boren first responds to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and we just really, this quote is actually exactly what, 77 years ago. He says, "There's no reason why this public concern should develop into an apprehension bordering on hysteria." So he's specifically talking about the fact that there's no reason to be alarmed by the fact that we have Japanese Americans living in LA. You know, they've been part of our city for quite a long time, selling our produce, you know, growing our food. And then even almost 2 months later, he says, "To the Japanese people residing in Los Angeles, let me give assurance that they have nothing to fear. Their rights will be respected, and they will receive full protection by our police. It is also my earnest wish that all residents of LA continue to treat both alien and native-born Japanese," and every time he says native-born Japanese, he's referring to the Nisei, maybe some Sansei too, but mostly Nisei, "with courtesy and respect, and that no advantage of any kind be taken of the Japanese people." Okay, so it's very similar to what he said right after Pearl Harbor. In fact, he had met with the JCL's anti-access committee. The JCL had set up this group to really promote patriotic displays by Japanese Americans and to promote cooperation with the government. And Boren had actually even gone to one of their events and recognized their loyalty. But by the time he's writing or speaking in January 28th, 1940, he's actually really had a change of heart. And sometimes politicians do this. They'll say one thing to the public for a certain effect, but they're actually doing something very, very different behind the scenes. If you can imagine that. We had a different, bombshell yesterday, right? So this is actually what he is saying behind the scenes by January, when he's now alarmed that, quote, "we are likely to have a second Pearl Harbor in Southern California." He's writing this to John Costello, who is a Democratic representative for Los Angeles. So he's starting to lobby Washington representatives already by this time. And he tells Commander Edward Hayes, and I had to look him up to remind myself who he was. He was one of the leaders of the American Legion. He was a very far-right, anti-communist, conservative. One contemporary journalist called him a semi-fascist even. But by World War II, he had actually become like a senior advisor, a special assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. And so, again, he's part of the military at this point. And what Boren says to him is, quote, "I feel that the native-born Japanese, the Nisei, present the most serious problem we have to face. And if carefully laid plots such as materialized in Honolulu or in the Philippines are ever duplicated in this country, the center of such perfidious activity will be in Los Angeles, and the actors will be native-born Japanese who have been educated at the expense of our taxpayers and who probably have been loudest in their declarations of loyalty to this country." So again, he's saying, what he's really arguing for, it's not enough to have the FBI go up and round up Issei. What we really need is basically to take everybody, and in order to make that argument, you have to say that the Nisei are actually the most dangerous element. "We here are most vitally concerned because we are the ones who are going to get the bombs if our seeming patriotic little Japanese brothers swing into action at a prearranged signal at an appointed time." And he says this over again, these kind of statements. He says, "This is not a time for sickly sentimentality, or this is not a time for a mistaken sense of brotherly love." And he even has one famous last words where he says, "Those who prayed about civil liberties, will be forgotten in the pages of history," or something like that, or disgraced. And he really starts to set his sight on a very prominent Nisei, Kiyoshi Patrick Okura. And Pat Okura had been he was sort of like the all-star. He was maybe like the first model minority Nisei. He goes to UCLA, I think not just for a bachelor's, but for a master's degree, and he plays on the varsity baseball team, right? And with all of this, he becomes one of the first employees of Japanese ancestry hired by the city of Los Angeles, and he moves himself up, into some moderate position. And for Boren, this becomes a conspiracy by Japan to invade, the city government, to learn about the power plants and the water plants. I mean, even when Japanese Americans are at Manzanar, Boren is saying, well, our water comes from up there, because LA steals its water from Northern California. So I'm not even comfortable, with Japanese Americans at Manzanar, right, behind barbed wire. And so he raises this alarm about Pat Okura and his sister and his family, and he's sort of making more and more of these speeches to the public calling for mass incarceration. And this was just one example of a response I read. I think this was in Togo Tanaka's diary where I read this, by a Nisei. I thought the mayor was a liberal and a man who had a scrupulous record for human justice and honesty. He's more of a pompous jackass and hypocrite from what I can gather. Right? So this is just before EO 9066 has been announced. But this is also a time when we start to see these expressions of interracial solidarity from so many of these young people that had grown up with Nisei as their friends, because LA was segregated when you think of where whites live versus where non-whites live. But it was very, very, mixed and integrated, where when you think of, Latinx and Chicanx youth were living and growing up in the same schools as Japanese Americans and some Chinese Americans. In this area, you have Little Tokyo and the Central Avenue District, which is the prominent, black neighborhood in LA, are very much overlapping and connecting with each other. So Ralph Lazo goes to Manzanar, right, to live with his friends, because he had grown up in Boyle Heights and on the east side with them. In the course of doing this research, I met an elder in Detroit named Nobu Shimakochi, and he was originally from LA and got resettled during the war. He had grown up with, really his best friend was an African American named Thomas Robinson, and they lived just south of here, and were part of the Japanese Christian church. And Thomas Robinson had, been in Boy Scouts with Japanese Americans. He'd been in these youth groups and athletic groups, and he felt such a sense of solidarity with this Shimakochi family that when they were in Santa Anita, he would go and gather food and supplies and things. He would sort of go there on a regular basis, and they would pass him notes for things he needed, and then he would go to the fence and pass food and goods through the barbed wire. So there's these acts of solidarity that were coming, not in overtly political sense, because there was very little political opposition. Clifford Clinton of Clifton's Cafeteria was actually one of the prominent LA people that publicly spoke out against what was happening. But for the most part, there wasn't a lot of political opposition, but you start to see this growing sense of solidarity coming from the grassroots level. So while that's happening, Boren remains the mayor. Japanese Americans are, incarcerated by 42 and certainly through 43. But that's not enough for him, because he says, what we really need to do is make sure they never come back to LA, right? And one of the ways to ensure that they have no rights, and no mobility is to end birthright citizenship, right? And so this is what he's pushing for, and he's working with DeWitt and others to prevent anyone from getting out of camp, right? And prevent them from coming back to the West Coast, and to take away birthright citizenship from the Nisei. So he says, quote, and he's doing these weekly radio addresses, right? So I'm gonna read from 3 in a row. On May 19th, 1943, he says, quote, when the war is over, it is hoped that we will not have again a large concentration of the Japanese population in Los Angeles. And again, he said pretty much the whole West Coast. By that time, some legal method, and remember, he was a judge, may be worked out to deprive the native-born Japanese of citizenship. The Japanese can never be assimilated. They are a race apart. The accident of birth should not make Japanese born on American soil of parents who are alien in legal effect and at heart citizens of the United States. Just the same as the descendants of the pioneer stock, so he's basically talking about Anglo-Americans, that has made America great. Made America great. It's these lines, they just come back and back in. America first, make America great. And a fixed standard for Americanism. So he's basically saying, again, Anglo-Americans are the standard for Americanism. Nisei are not entitled to those same citizenship rights of whites. Okay, so this is, again, something he takes up the following week. And the radio station was KCEA. I don't remember exactly what that was. But he has this platform in the media that he uses. And so again, on May 26, 43, he says, Japanese Americans are subjects of Mikado. Quote, to the Japs, he is still a Jap, and to us, he should still be a Jap. Very similar to the types of things DeWitt was saying. And he talks about how he was constantly in contact with DeWitt, and he took some credit for, influencing DeWitt. He attacks the, quote, well-meaning American citizens who would like to embrace the Japanese as brothers. So this is a time when people are saying you should start at least letting some of these, college students who are Nisei, out of the camps, or let people do some, work. He insists that the U.S., quote, win the war the only way that it can be won, by killing Japanese rather than by loving them. And again, no distinction between, people in the Japanese military and Nisei who want to go to college. I feel that there are not and never can be such a thing as Japanese Americans. So, if you're of Japanese ancestry, you can't be American, right? Even with the hyphen. And he said, quote, the Nisei citizenship claim hangs by a very narrow legal thread, Constitution of the United States, to some people. But to him, it's a very narrow legal thread and can be easily changed by Congress. It's the exact same thing, actually, Donald Trump said, and people pointed out, no, it's in the 14th Amendment. But this is what Boren, a very actually liberal-minded mayor who has a background in law and was a judge, is saying, and of course Earl Warren is saying similar things, and he also comes from a legal background and became known as a very liberal Supreme Court Chief Justice. Okay, so again, 2 weeks in a row he's talked about this, and then imagine, you hear from a politician like once a week where they're saying things, right? Imagine being bombarded in the media once a week by your political leaders like that, right? So he gets on the radio again, June 2nd, 1943. And at this point, Dylan Meyer of the WRA, is a very controversial history, but at this point, at least Dylan Meyer is saying, start letting, these loyalty, questionnaires have been done, at least let some of the loyal, quote unquote, Nisei out. And Boren is saying, no way, we will never let that happen. And Dylan Meyer had pointed out that Japanese Americans had not committed any act of sabotage, right? He's basically saying there's nothing, no evidence, no evidence at all to warrant these fears. And what Boren says is, quote, the Japanese are too smart for that, right? In other words, he's saying, if you're planning a sneak attack, then what you do is you act very loyal and you abide by the law and wave the flag so that you can be even more sneaky, right? He says, we in Los Angeles ought to know our Japs. We are not going to be fooled if others are, people like Dylan Meyer. And those Japanese released through warm human sympathy of the administrators of the War Relocation Authority had better not come back to Los Angeles, right? So now he's just issuing the flat out warning, threats, and pretty much emboldening anyone in LA to carry out acts of, violence or hatred against Japanese Americans who came back. And there were even Nisei, 442nd, right? People in uniform who were getting harassed when they were on break and things like that when they were coming to the West Coast at this time. And he also writes to the Assistant Attorney General, Tom Clark. He's a very important figure in U.S. history. He goes on to higher positions after this, right around this same time of May 1943. And he's making it clear that he's completely against the return of any Japanese Americans to the West Coast. And this is a really interesting thing that stood out when I was looking back at my notes from the Huntington Library. He says, quote, I believe that the use of Japanese as domestics is fraught with the greatest danger, okay? As a matter of fact, it is generally understood that much of the information secured by the Japanese government in the coastal area, again, to plan these invasions and attacks, right, so-called, during the past quarter of a century, so this is going back to, he would say, 1918, I guess, so the migration of Japanese Issei to work as gardeners and domestics was part of this elaborate plan to invade the West Coast. He says, this was through the placing of domestics in the homes of important people. And this is really interesting to me because my mother is here and she actually worked as a domestic after the war in the home of a very wealthy, elite white family in Seattle. So that's a personal residence when she was in high school even. He says, quote, a houseboy of one of our prominent local families later was identified as a high-ranking officer of the Japanese Navy. So the domestics are the biggest threats. And that was also interesting to me for a second reason, because I don't know if people saw, there was this really phenomenal article that the New York Times published just a few days ago. I mean, there's been so many, but this incredibly courageous woman named Victorina Morales told her story that in fact she's actually been working as a, service cleaner, right, in one of Donald Trump's, most visited by him golf club resorts, and she says she's actually been making his bed on a regular basis, but she herself is an undocumented immigrant, so she just could not stay quiet anymore while the president demonized people like her who actually are making his bed. So I just thought it was interesting that, during World War II, the mayor said the domestics are the biggest danger, to national security. Now, what's even more fascinating in this story is that after World War II, the mayor almost completely shifts his tone. And he says, for example, it is immediately recognized that we must do more than make friendly declarations and statements indicating that government will afford its citizens their constitutionally guaranteed rights and privileges. So he's talking about Japanese Americans coming back to LA. We must implement programs with action to ensure the integration of returning Americans of Japanese ancestry shall be completed smoothly and in a manner which assures the continued unity of all of our people in the war effort. And he says the city government is developing plans to assist with bringing people back and allowing Nisei to return to jobs they have with the city. And he goes further to issue an apology to the JACL, to the 442nd and Japanese American community at this big dinner banquet that the JACL organizes to honor the 442nd vets in 1946. And this is what he says. The accomplishments of these Nisei troops have found their place in the annals of military history. So on behalf of the city of LA and the people of this community, may I express a deep appreciation for the service, the contribution, the loyalty of these good Americans of Japanese blood, who have served their country and served it well, who have dispelled all doubt, and he was one of the biggest doubters, and who have written a record of service and valor in which we all take great and lasting pride. To all of the Nisei, all of you Japanese Americans home from the war, a genuine, sincere, heartfelt welcome, right? And he confirms this in a private letter he writes a decade later, saying, I was entirely wrong in ever entertaining a suspicion as to the local residents of the Japanese race. So maybe people can change, right? He actually says he was one who supported even Japanese Americans getting compensation and that he aided their resettlement. And sorry, I forgot to put the quote up. And I think this is just really fascinating, again, to think about how this 180-degree reversal was possible, at least at one moment in history. And there are a lot of reasons why, right? Obviously, he had a change of heart, and at least he had some decency and honesty within him to do that assessment based on facts as they actually changed in his mind. But I think it's not just that he as an individual did something noble or intelligent. When we think about power, there are two ways to think about it, right? Power as something exercised over people, as we oftentimes think about traditional political leadership. There are people in power that rule over others. But when we think of power we think about power horizontally. We think about power is something collectively gathered by people working together, right? And I think that's really important. That this shift in attitude towards Japanese Americans, it came from, again, the actions of the 442nd, it came from the work of civil rights activists, but it also came from people of diverse races and backgrounds, coming together and working together in new ways. And so this is where this really fascinating history of Little Tokyo and Bronzeville comes together. This is actually a picture of the mayor in Little Tokyo, posing with members of the African American community. But Little Tokyo was really known as a big problem for the city during World War II. It was called the neighborhood of last resort. You have thousands of African Americans coming from the South, fleeing the horrendous, violent white supremacist, Ku Klux Klan, type activities in the South, but also looking for the new jobs, right? Because LA is adding, jobs for people building ships, and it's adding, jobs in the aviation industry to support the war effort. And so much of LA's economy and population booms because of the World War II economy. And this creates an opening for a new form of black civil rights activism, because originally these jobs were only open to whites for the most part. Explicitly, African Americans were told, even if you have education, we won't hire you. And almost the vast majority of all housing in the city was closed off to people who were African American, and in some cases Japanese Americans and Mexican Americans too. So what you have is this upsurge in political activity organized around a group called the Negro Victory Committee. And the idea was, if we want to win the war, then it's going to require everyone to have equal rights to participate, in these jobs and activities. So there were calls to end discrimination in the defense industries and in housing, because if you can get a job and you can't live somewhere in the city, then you really don't have the right to the job either. And there was a response to the hostility that was directed towards these new African American migrants from the South, particularly around the need to improve housing conditions in Little Tokyo, because people weren't just crowding into Little Tokyo, they were living in spaces that weren't residential at all. They were living in storefronts, they were living in shacks, they were living in places not meant for human habitation. And out of this, you begin to see a new vision of multiracial solidarity. So I want to close by really focusing more on that. Some of this occurs in response to the Suit Riots. And there's a complicated history here, but essentially this is where, Navy and police officers are just going around and beating up young men of color, particularly Chicanos who wear quote-unquote zoot suits, saying that they're a public menace and a gang problem, and lots of innocent people were beaten and jailed. And so this was actually something that was taken up as part of the agenda of black civil rights activists during World War II. And here's a picture with some of them, where they want to focus first on Clayton Russell, who's second from your right. He was a very vibrant pastor at People's Independent Church of Christ, which really surged in numbers with this new growth of the community. He said these riots had taught, quote, a great lesson to African Americans. It has welded us ever closer to the Mexican community of this city. That is good, for one of the clear requisites for victory is the unity of all minority groups, Jews, Chinese, Negroes, Mexicans, and the oppressed people of the world. And they demanded justice for riot victims, discipline of police officers who were involved, and a removal of all racist elements from the military who participated in this. Now, it's interesting that he talks about this coalition, but one of the things you can see at this point is Japanese Americans aren't in LA, and so he's not mentioning that, right? But this is starting to change too during World War II. So here's an example of an article that was in The Crisis, which was the magazine of the NAACP, civil rights group, by Harry Paxton Howard, specifically addressing Japanese Americans. He said, quote, "Even among the Negroes along the coast, many failed to realize that the issue was basically racial and directly concerned themselves. Japanese Americans have been plundered of everything and crowded in concentration camps fit only for pigs. For if Asiatic Americans can be reduced to bondage, deprived of citizenship and of property, the same can be done to Afro-Americans and to Jews. This is an integral part of the struggle for human and racial equality. It concerns every Negro," right? So he's saying basically an injury to one is injury in all. And Charlotta Bass of the California Eagle, which was the most prominent black newspaper in LA at the time, really takes up this call for justice for all. And so at this moment when, Boren had been saying, don't let, Japanese Americans come back to LA, she writes a column editorial that says, "The eyes of the world are focused on California," and basically says that how the state handles this issue of Japanese Americans coming out of the camps would be the ultimate test of whether the state would, quote, live up to its tradition of democracy or become a breeding place for fascism. She condemned the usual arrogance born of ignorance and bigotry exhibited by those Americans, but by those who insisted that these Americans born of a different race than their own shall not return to their former homes. And she advocated for, again, a multiracial civil rights coalition. Just going to gloss over the next. There were some complaints that these coalitions were very hard to come together. So Almina Davis of a rival paper, African American, the Tribune, said yes, but there have been these conflicts that the relations currently do stink. So she had a slightly, very actually different view. But she also hired Hisaya Yamamoto to be a writer for this African American newspaper. One of the sources of conflict was on this question of what will happen when Japanese Americans come back to Little Tokyo, that's now a predominantly black neighborhood. And you can see, you know, before he had this change of heart in the New York Times, Fletcher Boren was cited as saying the city had adjusted its whole economy to, quote, the exclusion of the Japanese. In other words, we know how to function now without them. And he warned that a serious situation with the possibility of race riots was in store because incoming Negro war workers had taken over Little Tokyo for their homes. So you can see Bowen is still now fanning the flames of trying to make Japanese Americans and black Americans go to war with each other. There was a conflict at a building that you may recognize, seen here, because this building became a Black Baptist church, right, during the war. And I'm going to let Ama Sensei tell us more about that story because it involves some lawsuits and a Jewish American, Julius Goldwater, who converted to Buddhism, who was overseeing it at the time. So there was this question, though, of there's not enough space for everyone. There was a housing shortage, right? There was a population surge. The other fascinating story occurs at the church on the other end of the block, the Union Church, which is where my daughter does the Tuesday night cafe performances now, and it's this amazing space where people come together. And it was also this amazing space where people came together during World War II, right? So the Union Church was actually formed by different congregations of Japanese ancestry coming together. But during the war, because it was owned, I think the building was owned by the Presbyterian Church. Maybe Beth can look in the archives more to help us understand that. It became a social service agency called Pilgrim House because you had so many low-income residents living in these very crowded conditions in Little Tokyo. And Pilgrim House was run as a social service agency in the Union Church by an African-American minister named Harold Kingsley, who was brought in from Chicago by the Presbyterian Church. It was called LA's Plymouth Rock and a Drifting Community. And it was designed to give hope to people who were impoverished and people who suffered racial discrimination. But in this moment when Japanese Americans are coming back, what they organized to try to promote, a smoother return to prevent these outbreaks of so-called riots and conflict that, the mayor was trying to drum up. They created a committee called the Common Ground Committee of Caucasians, Japanese, and Negroes. And they hired a Nisei named Samuel Ishikawa to help organize this. And he brought in children from the Koyasan hostel to interact and play with the predominantly black population of children who were being served by the Pilgrim House. And they also started a new interracial church. So Kingsley was a minister, who was African-American. G. Raymond Booth was a white American. And they also brought in a Nisei minister named Royden Susumago to do these joint services for a multiracial congregation. And so it's really fascinating that there's this kind of forgotten history that I was able to learn about of this agency in Little Tokyo during World War II that called itself a port of entry of interpretation of adjustment, a proven instrument for preventing racial friction. So it really had its goal as to bringing diverse people together, particularly people from so-called minority groups. Although most of the children who come to Pilgrim House for their daily fun are Negroes, there are some of Mexican and Caucasian origin, and the returning Japanese Americans are happy to find its doors wide open to them. And this is in their promotional materials. Obviously you have to look at the actual history, but this is how they at least want to be seen, right? This is a sort of new dynamic in really promoting this ideal even. We are also the only playground as well as community center for about 5,000 people. 150 children a day use our facilities, 400 once a week. Now, what was really fascinating is they pointed out that there was no gym or recreation center suitable for this growing population of young people in Little Tokyo. And so they're advocating for this, but quite tragically, before any of this happens, they get shut down. Right? So they close on October 16th, 1950. So why did they close? What was going on, right? So think about where the Union Church is, and think about what's next to it is a parking garage for Parker Center, right? And so what's happening at this moment after the war is, it's a very low-income residential neighborhood, right? A lot of old buildings, and this becomes marked for redevelopment, right? And so this the Union Church, thankfully, is still there, right? But the Pilgrim House, where its building was, carrying out these social service activities, gets torn down, against the wishes of many people, against the protests of even some prominent politicians, because the city is now looking to, cater to elite development of Bunker Hill by chasing out low-income residents, and then, of course, expanding the city government and its buildings and the police. But there was one final story that I came across that I thought was really important to remember, because while it seems like, again, all the little people are being pushed out and they don't have a voice, there was an attempt by the Nisei Progressives, which is a new group that formed after World War II, to really help organize and advocate for the concerns of low-income people of color. And it was formed by Nisei activists such as Sakaya Ishihara, Art Takei, and Tsukuni Tomi to further the economic and social rights of Japanese Americans and really of all people of all races. So again, in 1949, the city condemned the property near First and San Pedro to develop the new LAPD headquarters. This is part of a much, much broader redevelopment plan for downtown. They evicted 2,500 of the area's residents. Most were African American, though most of the rest were Japanese American. And the Nisei Progressives protested these evictions. They said it was unjust. They also talked about the small businesses that were being pushed out and what the history that would be lost with the demolition. And they did not stop it completely. Obviously, at some point, the demolition stopped because we're still here on this historic block right now. But at least they got the city and the mayor to agree to find suitable lodging for those being evicted at a comparable rent that they can afford. So again, it's not a total victory, but I think historically it really starts to turn the tide towards people thinking about, again, the needs of existing residents, of low-income residents, of not just turning everything over to the wealthy and powerful, and establishing this important history of Little Tokyo as a historic Japanese American community, but also as a community that's had a history of interaction with African Americans, of other immigrants from Europe, of Jews, of people of lots of different races. And I think that's important because we're in this moment, right, where there's all kinds of headlines that are scary, that are threatening, that are dangerous. We sort of see them on a regular basis. But 2020 presents this important opportunity, right, to make a historical statement in a new way and to change this tide of, intolerance and bigotry and xenophobia and create this sense of community that people really want, where they can come together. And of course, I'm talking about the fact that the gym that people wanted 75 years ago is scheduled to open in 2020, right? So here's a chance for this ongoing history of Little Tokyo as a Japanese American, but also a multi-ethnic space to really live up to the ideal that some of the biggest dreamers of social justice and equality envisioned many, many generations ago. So thank you very much. I will stop there.
Now it's just time to ask our presenters up here any questions. Obviously, we heard quite a bit about different kinds of acts of solidarity, whether on an individual level, like Emily Light, or in more public kind of ways. Scott talked about Charlotta Bass from LA Eagle, these Pilgrim House, kind of like institutional structural levels of interracial solidarity. And so I think I have a lot of personal questions, but first I'd like to open it up to anybody in the audience. And
hi, my name's Vicky Uemura, and I want to ask a question about after the war. I know a lot of people went to Chicago. Was it because they didn't want the Japanese Americans to come back to California?
I have talked to many people in the Chicago area, and I think it was, this is not from research I've done, it's just from oral histories that I have conducted, that it was both because in certain areas of the West Coast, they were not encouraged to come back. In fact, I live in Santa Cruz, and in Monterey, I know that there was actually a petition that was signed to allow Japanese Americans to come back, that John Steinbeck and some of his friends, artist friends, had actually signed, because there was all these reports in the newspaper, we don't want you back, blah, blah, blah. But also, I think a lot of Japanese Americans had hard feelings about how they were treated on the West Coast and didn't want to come back. And so they resettled in areas that they were able to go to, like Cleveland, like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and just started lives there and never came back. And so there's actually I think that resettlement is kind of the new area that we should all be talking about. It's a story that most of us don't really understand unless you live in the Midwest. And so I think that it's interesting. One thing that I learned about Chicago specifically is that they were encouraged to go and resettle there, but they were discouraged from congregating. So there is no Japantown. There's no area where Japanese would come together, because they were discouraged from even living near each other, which is a way for them to assimilate, but also kind of disappear into the population.
Yeah, I think I would agree with all of that. I think the first thing that's important to note is the first Nisei to leave the camps after the so-called loyalty oaths are administered aren't allowed to go to the West Coast at all, right? They're allowed to go to the military, or they're allowed to go to the East Coast. Chicago is sort of the biggest city that they could go to. New York, for a while, was extremely hostile towards Japanese Americans. Mayor LaGuardia, who himself obviously comes from, an immigrant community, he has this statement where he said, I don't want any Japanese Americans to be allowed to leave these camps and come to New York. So Chicago was seen as a relatively better destination. Detroit too. Detroit had some really prominent community leaders. There's a church right in downtown Detroit that really went out. It's almost like it was like a sanctuary church of that time, welcoming Nisei to the city, and to be there. So I think that was part of it. Eventually, a lot of the Nisei did come back from places like Chicago and Detroit. So the people I've interviewed in Detroit are actually the people that chose to stay. So it's really interesting to get that contrast. I interviewed Toko Tanako some years back. He had gone to Chicago and really become this prominent leader of the Japanese American community in Chicago. But a lot of folks were looking to come back to LA. But initially, right, there were these reports of people having their houses firebombed, of people like I think it was the flower market here was trying to ban Japanese Americans from having stalls in the market. So there were these incidents of violence and discrimination that were really discouraging, especially in '45 and then right after the war ended.
maybe I could just add a quick word about Chicago. We did have a program in our series on resettlement where we had 3 speakers talk about the Chicago resettlement, and there's a great it's forthcoming, but a film that's being put together by Jason Matsumoto in Chicago about the resettlement. And one of the other, Kimiko brought it up, the assimilation kind of project of the WRA and kind of leave clearance and resettlement. It played out in different ways, I think, in Chicago around, for example, Buddhist temples. There's a Midwest Buddhist temple, Chicago. But initially, they were having a lot of trouble, getting permission to even form a so-called, ethnic temple that would be predominantly Japanese American, because it didn't fit with the program. But also, many white neighborhoods refused to allow the Buddhists to gather, and so initially Japanese Americans, again, just to go back to Scott's kind of comments earlier, often had conversations, relationships with African Americans in Chicago to be able to ultimately get their Buddhist temple organized. So anyway, other questions?
Up here.
My name is Manuel. I'm from West Los Angeles. My grandfather used to tell us stories. He used to tell us about the Santa Monica Civic being a reception center for this whole time, this incident. He also told me that there was, he grew up in an area called Sawtelle, which at the time they were mining bricks from where the 405 freeway now lies. He was a hod carrier, and he told us stories that when the Japanese nurseries folks, they kind of had to leave their nurseries behind, and a lot of the Mexicans in that community just kind of picked up and kept them running until they got back. Is there any documentation or video coverage of intercooperation between the Chicano community in West Los Angeles and the Japanese Americans, business owners in those areas?
Yeah, I think there is some. I mean, I hadn't done that specific research because I was really interested in how Japanese Americans and African Americans had this sort of similar trajectory moving from this area right here downtown, and which was really then known as part of the East Side, to the West Side. So initially around USC, where the center is, and then into Crenshaw, and then I kind of my work stopped there. But Sawtelle was always an interesting place because LA was segregated. You have literally these neighborhoods being built for anywhere from 1,000 to sometimes 5,000-10,000 new residents, and the developer is basically making everyone sign a contract that says only whites will live here. You will never sell this house to anyone who's not white, right? But because LA was sprawling and it had these sort of agricultural districts from before, you had these older districts like Sawtelle and some other places that were racially diverse. And I think it's interesting. There were some farmers in the Sawtelle area, Japanese American, and there was certainly a lot of interaction between Japanese American farm workers and Chicano Mexican American farm workers. There were a lot of really significant labor strikes and labor actions, even going back to the early 20th century, more in Southern California generally. There were also some cases where the Japanese Issei farmers had become the growers, and sometimes were in conflict with workforces that were a mix of Japanese and Mexican immigrants. The Sawtelle area was also where you had a lot of the Japanese Issei gardeners living, and so there's just a really interesting history there about how Issei are really sort of at the founding of the gardening industry in LA, when all these suburban neighborhoods are popping up throughout the city because everybody wants to have this nice big lawn and garden, but these white middle class people don't all want to do that work, so they're hiring immigrants to do it. And of course, over time, you have Latinx immigrants both working and then eventually taking over, the independent contracting work in that field. So I think that's another interesting history. And I think among the youth, there's probably a lot of interesting intersections there too. But I'm hoping someone else is doing all that research?
I don't know anything specifically about the West LA and Sawtelle, but just a quick note that there is a play running right now at the Mark Taper Forum called Valley of the Heart, and it's set elsewhere, actually in more like San Jose area, that valley, and it's in part a love story between a Japanese American Nisei woman and the Mexican American farmhand, and then it's a love story on the face of it, but it's also an amazing history lesson about interracial solidarity between Mexican Americans and Japanese Americans, because in this case, as Scott was saying, it's a Japanese American owner of the farm. Of course, the land put in the name of the Nisei son because of those laws, but then they have to figure out what to do when they're suddenly uprooted, and this Mexican American family that's been on the farm is going to step in and help out. And so it's a play, and I think it's having a good run over at Mark Taper Forum right now.
Yeah, Richard Katsuda, and Scott, when you're talking about Boren and his quote change of heart in terms of his policies, views toward Japanese Americans, I guess I want to look at that a little bit and wonder if it's what you really meant by that, or in terms of, like, you think of Boren and what he did, think of Earl Warren, think of even FDR, where during the Depression, he says we had nothing to fear but fear itself, yet during World War II, he fans up the fears against Japanese Americans. And so anyway, thinking about even today during what's happening with our current administration and certain people who privately say they are against what our administration is doing, but publicly won't say anything about it. I just wonder, that whole idea of calling it a change of heart, whether what is really behind, like Bowen's, what you call, whether it's flip-flopping or just going with whatever he sees as the political wins or whatever. Same with Earl Warren, who later became the great champion of civil rights and all. And so just that whole idea of change of heart makes me, I want to kind of dig a little bit more on what you think about what that means exactly.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I totally agree that politicians change policies not just because of their sort of individual values, but because of what's politically expedient at one time or another, what's economically, to them of interest. In Bowen's case, because he actually did take some actions before the war that were consistent with civil liberties and civil rights, there is probably some justification in looking at whether, he individually, his statements actually do have some sincerity, where he says, I was wrong, I admit it, and I saw the truth. With some other politicians, it may not be so easy to see if there's anything really sincere in what they say. But definitely there are a lot of factors that go way beyond the individuals, right? And so, one is that during World War II, Japan is using the U.S. mass incarceration of Japanese Americans as propaganda, right? To stir up anti-American sentiment in Asia, right? Japan is trying to rally, all Asians to come together against basically the white devils. And so that's one thing that makes a difference. Yuji Joke, who was one of my, senseis, said, he really felt that was a big factor in how the 442nd was formed. And we know the 442nd was formed, and Mike Masaoka really wanted this, right? As not just fighting, and they did some incredible fighting, but also to promote U.S. propaganda, right? In the U.S. and more even so around the world. So that was a big part of it. The fact that Japan becomes a staunch ally of the U.S. after World War II, and the focus is not on, Japanese fascism or Hitler anymore, but it's on the Soviet Union and the Cold War, right? So the fact that Japan basically has its constitution written by the U.S. and has been occupied by the U.S. and is at the center of U.S. anti-communist foreign policy and militarism in World War II. That makes a big difference in why immigration policies towards Japan change, why people saw the film Sayonara, probably why the issue of military brides and interracial marriage changes. And then, of course, you have the war with Korea, and you get new adoption policies and things coming of that. So this whole idea of Japan and Asia as sort of the children of U.S. empire, and now they're part of our family, that all really starts to change because of the shift in politics and capitalism after. So I think that's a big part of it too. But the other thing that becomes really important is this idea of tolerance. One, it's something that the liberals were in power, at that time, and even I'm including some of the Republicans that generally subscribe to these liberal ideas. So they were very confident, and they didn't have to look at so much of it from a question of fear, but they could look at it from a question of power. How could we grow the economy in LA? And so Boren is, and Tom Bradley goes even further with this, talking about, let's think of LA as a city of tolerance. You can even think about Atlanta reinvents itself, after Jim Crow in that way. How do we think about it in terms of tolerance so that we can have economic growth, so we can have global commerce, so that we could welcome trade, with Japan and Asia? So all of that is factoring in, like the trade with Japan and Asia just skyrockets, after World War II. And then, of course, you get, in the 1980s, you get the kind of Japan bashing and the fear that Japan's taking over. But from the 50s to the 70s, it was this idea that, this global tolerance and exchange is going to be good for business in LA. So the business community is, in large measure, behind it, too.
Hi, I'm Bob Moriguchi. This is not a question, but just a statement. In 42 and 43, I was in the 5th grade at Amachi. And I had a Caucasian teacher. His name was John W. Cochran. And he was very supportive and very tolerant person. I had corresponded with him all through my elementary school, my high school, and then when I got into college, I kind of lost track of him. But these Caucasian teachers who came to teach at our camps, they had to live in the same substandard housing that we did. And so we owed them a lot of gratitude, a heap of gratitude. And so they should be recognized in some aspects, for their contribution to what they did for us. And anyway, that's the statement I just wanted to make. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there were some wonderful arts programs that were done. There were murals. It's fascinating. I was reading about Isamu Noguchi, right, who was one of my favorite artists, and I think one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. He had this grand vision, because he could have gone to the East Coast, right? He had enough contacts and friends, but he was going to go to Poston, right? And he really wanted to make this an opportunity to empower people to express themselves and to. But then he was like, this place is so terrible to live here. And it's like, people aren't responding to my avant-garde ideas of modern art. So he left, right? After he tried some noble things. And so the people that really stuck it out, I think, that didn't have to be there. Obviously, they weren't under the same types of threats. But I think that is important to recognize. And one person I met in Detroit, who's part of this history, is Marianne Mahaffey. I met her when she was president of the Detroit City Council. This is a Hakujin woman who's getting the most votes for city council in a city that's over 80% African American. So it shows that people saw her as a champion of social justice and equality, and they really saw her as someone they could respect, right? Who was a person of integrity. But she said that so much of her, and she was a social worker for her career before she went into politics. And she's passed away, sadly. But she said that so much of the foundation of her, identity and being came from the fact that she volunteered to be a teacher at Poston during World War II. Right, and that never left her. She maintained these lifelong friendships. The reason I got to know her so well was not just because I was involved in city, politics in Detroit. She was on the board of the JACL with me, and she was this lifetime member of the JACL. And she always equated the social justice work she did to preventing, another mass incarceration from happening and learning the lessons, of World War II.
Hi, my name is Miki Fujimoto, and my question is for Scott. I think the paradigm that is ubiquitous through any type of discipline and looking at race relationships is sort of white other. Like what are the African Americans doing relationship to the dominant white culture? What are Asian Americans doing, et cetera, et cetera. And my question is, in the field of Asian American studies, do you feel like there has been any progress in doing the type of work that you're doing, where the paradigm is, okay, what are communities of color doing with each other? What is the relationship? What is the history? Because a lot of that has just basically been wiped out of the history books, pretty much. Where do you feel the state of that is in terms of Asian American studies?
I'm actually very optimistic. So when I started doing, this work, so I started grad school, just to date myself. The first year of grad school for me was when UCLA had a big 50th anniversary commemoration of EO 9066, right? And at that time, I was just thinking, I thought there's so much about World War II that people are doing that I didn't need to focus on that in my studies so much. But obviously I wound up doing quite a bit. So it's interesting to be here today because particularly after 9/11, I started to realize, how much you can never do enough, right, to remember this history. And it's going to keep coming back to us even more so. But that's where, like, what you're saying is I wanted to remember it not just from looking at, white racism and how it affected minority groups, but how that created the beginning, at least, right, of a paradigm shift in how we think of identity and community and race. And it turns out that some of this predates even World War II, if you go back and look. Again, obviously the history of Boyle Heights, Janum has done a great, exhibit a number of years ago on Boyle Heights, and George Sanchez has written about this, and Natalia Molina has written about this, and other scholars started doing the research a lot to a much greater degree in the 90s, and then these books started coming out sort of in the first decade of the 21st century. Some of them came out before my book. And now, actually, when I read about graduate students starting their graduate studies and research, they're actually saying, like, the core of their studies is looking at Afro-Asian relations or culture, looking at multi-ethnic relations, interethnic relations. So there's been a huge shift. And the thing I forgot to mention, right, the reason so many of us started looking at the 90s is because of the LA uprising in 92 and the so-called Black Korean conflict. There was this kind of dystopian, narrative that says we all hate each other and we can't get along and we're all going to, tear down, this community. But in fact, there was always this history that was being overlooked. I was part of the group that fought to get the Holiday Bowl recognized as a historic cultural landmark in LA particularly because of its history of multi-ethnic and particularly Black Japanese history in Crenshaw. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of people in graduate school and in history departments and ethnic studies departments doing this type of work. How much that affects the rest of society, it doesn't affect it immediately. It's not going to change, who Donald Trump wants to be the next Supreme Court justice. It may affect who the next president is. If people like Kamala Harris are running, but it's definitely affecting the way younger people talk and interact with each other. And it's not just because people are teaching about it. It's because what we're writing about and teaching about matches their own experiences, like growing up very differently, whether they themselves are in multi-ethnic communities or they themselves are, biracial, multiracial.
My name's Hal Kamey. Regarding Bronzeville, when the war ended and JA started coming back to LA, were there problems getting the African Americans to leave the Little Tokyo area?
Yeah, I mean, there's it's a very complicated story, right? So the simple story is, again, you have people like Boren, saying there's going to be riots, they all hate each other, and putting out one extreme. Then you have fabulous stories like that come out in Ebony magazine. And I was going to put it up on the screen, but then I realized I gave a talk in this exact room like 8 years ago, and I didn't want to repeat everything I had done then, especially since that one was recorded too. So Ebony magazine comes out with a story that becomes the sort of exemplar of this notion that there's this new form of solidarity. They call it the mix of like, what is it, of Japanese and jazz, or something like sukiyaki and chitlins, you know. Holiday Bowl reflects a lot of it. So there are these stories of people coming together in ways, but there are some there are some on the ground conflicts of interest, right? Again, like this building, there was a Baptist congregation here. There was, you know, there were people renting out spaces, and then there were other people who didn't have anywhere else to live, but then they were living in places that had been small businesses, right? And people wanted their small businesses back, or people wanted their, you know, apartments and houses back. So the big thing was, because so many of the residents, the black residents, who were low-income Southern migrants, they had no ownership, you know, they had no long-term leases, they didn't have any type of security. So some of them just had their leases in probably and just had to find somewhere else to go. Again, a lot of them were in these places that were torn down for the redevelopment. But there were some cases, where there were attempts by people to stay. And it's really interesting to look at sort of what Nisei were privately saying, right? So some of them are saying, well, you know, like, it's only fair, like, we lost these spaces, we get to come back. But there are also some saying that, like, some of these Nisei landlords or Issei landlords are so ruthless, like they're taking advantage of people, you know, they're going beyond what the law allows them to do. And then there was this whole controversy over, is Little Tokyo a safe neighborhood, right? So there are people that said there's more crime in Little Tokyo now with the new residents. There's other people saying those are racial stereotypes. You know, there's a long history of, you know, racist stereotypes. And there was this question of whether, so there was this controversy when some group of, you know, Little Tokyo Chamber of Commerce or something like that proposes to have the 442nd, hiring 442nd veterans to patrol the streets of Little Tokyo to make sure it's safe, you know, for whatever, Japanese American elders, or, you know. And then some of these same debates surface when I was researching Crenshaw in the 1970s as well, right? So again, there are always these concerns people have over, is there enough space for housing? Are the rents, you know, affordable? And that puts people in competition with each other regardless of what race they are, right? But then there's also these ways in which racial discourses, some people would say racial stereotypes or racism, get overlaid with these concerns about, space and education and crime. And what I've tried to point out is, you know, again, there are these ideals on one end, and there are these kind of, you know, divisive narratives on the other. And the point is not that we can just say one is right and one is wrong. It's a messy reality, and that's how history is made. And the question is, how do you deal with these? How do you understand the sources of conflict? Do you understand them as, oh, everyone hates each other because they'll never get along, you know, or my side is right and the other side is right? Or do you understand it as there has to be new principles of solidarity that people, you know, put into practice so that there is some kind of, like, you know, way to think about justice in a collective sense and not just in an individual sense.
My name is Richard Murakami. If you don't mind, I want to kind of change the subject a little bit. Kimiko, you've been to pilgrimages, and you are heading the pilgrimage for Jerome Roller. I've been to a few pilgrimages, and I think everybody here is like me. We're here to learn something, and always learn something new when it comes to something like this. Why do you think it's important for people to consider going to a pilgrimage, and what can they learn?
Oh my God. Gosh, let's see. I'll start with Japanese Americans first. I think it would be beneficial to every Japanese American who had family incarcerated to go to a pilgrimage where their family was incarcerated, and if they can attend with the person that was actually in camp, which is getting rarer and rarer, that's an amazing experience to have, first of all, just on a personal family level. I was able to go to Topaz. My family was in Topaz, and I went to Topaz with my mother last year. So it brings up a lot of memories and stories that people don't always talk about. I mean, of course, there's the stereotype that Nisei don't talk about their experience, which sometimes they do, and really, if you're interested, they will talk to you. It's just you have to ask them. They're not going to volunteer it, but they're more apt to talk about it when they're at a pilgrimage. So you're hearing firsthand accounts. And if we're lucky, we have maybe 5 more years of that, where people are actually able to travel. So I encourage everybody to go to a pilgrimage. As next year, 2019, we're going to go. My project and I, we're going to go to 7. Definitely go. And for anybody who is maybe Japanese, like if they're Shin and their family came after the war, or if you're not Japanese, you're another ethnicity, I think it's important to go to hear the stories also, because you can really understand why it's so important that this kind of thing doesn't ever happen again, and how easily it could happen, especially for our youth. So if anybody goes, please bring your millennials, please bring your teenagers, because this is going to sound strange, because most of us here, I think, are older, not millennials, but for somebody who is in their 20s, they have no concept of war in general, world war. I'm 45. I don't have a concept of world war either, knock on wood. But it's, to them, World War II is almost like ancient history. It's so far back, it doesn't affect them, it doesn't mean anything to them. And I was struck by this because I went to a Day of Remembrance event last year, and on the UCSC campus, and they invited the Muslim Student Union to come. And there was a student sitting next to me, a young Muslim student, and the speaker asked us to talk to the person next to us and ask why we were there. And so I asked him, why you're here? And he said, to learn about the incarceration and such. And then he was like, why are you here? And I said, well, because my mother was incarcerated in Topaz, Utah. I mean, the kid's face was like, and then he looks at me and he goes, people are still alive that were in camp? And I said, yes, they are, and here's a picture on my phone. And see what I mean? Like at 19, 20 years old, the concept that there are still people living that had these experiences it's not even on their radar. So that's why I think it's just really, really, really important for people to attend. And I know that some people have said, I've gone to the camp on my own. Totally different when you go on a pilgrimage, totally different vibe, totally different atmosphere. I mean, I can't even say enough. I would talk for like 5 hours about how awesome pilgrimages are. So, and almost every camp has something. And so I would recommend anybody who is interested to find out, when the pilgrimage is for the camp they're interested in going, and go.
Thank you. I agree with you. The reason I ask that is because I really believe that everybody should attend a pilgrimage, including those that lived it, because then you could share your story. So thank you for saying what you just said.
What do you think is unique about going to Arkansas versus, of course, lots more folks have gone to Manzanar and places closer to where we are on the West Coast?
I think most people, your general idea when you say, for people who have a basic knowledge of the camps, you say, camp, and you're picturing desert, dust, windstorms, scorpions, things like that. But you don't think about Arkansas. That was swamp. So it's swamp, water moccasins, mushroom, hunting for mushrooms. There's totally different stories. Plus, you're in the Jim Crow South. And that is something, I mean, I wish, I would love to be able to do a project on that as well. But just talking about people's experiences in camp in the Jim Crow South. I mean, it's a totally different thing where if they went into the local town from camp, they didn't know, do I drink from the colored fountain? Do I drink from the whites only fountain? I mean, I've heard many stories where people said, I got on a bus and I sat in the back and the bus driver stopped the bus and said, no, you have to get up in the front. People just didn't know, where do I fit in? And those are really fascinating stories that I don't think are very prevalent in the discussion about camp. So that's another, allyship or minority. I mean, I've heard stories where some of the residents, usually these are children that the people I talk to, they were usually children in camp. And I've heard stories where they had friends outside of camp, residents in the nearby town, where they would walk to the corner of wherever the camp perimeter was, and they would bury some money in a can for soda. And then one of the locals, kids, would go and take the money, buy them soda that they couldn't get in camp, and they would leave it there, and they would have these exchanges. So, I mean, there's a million stories that I've only heard a handful, but I mean, I definitely feel like those are a different concept of camp that we don't have.
Hi, my name is Tom Kaufman. From a Hawaii perspective, Scott, the Fair Play Committee of California appears to be sort of a civic society stab at saving the Japanese community from mass internment. And it appears to be ineffectual. There were people from Hawaii who were being contacted at the last minute by the Fair Play Committee. And I wonder what your perspective was on the Fair Play Committee and the extent to which, their good impulse had any long-term effect.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't do a lot of study of that particular group, but I did sort of look at that sort of grouping of kind of liberal-minded, civil liberties-minded, and of course we know even the ACLU didn't take a really, really strong stand, right, initially, folks, and what they could and could not accomplish. And obviously they couldn't turn the political tide, once that sort of, once that momentum picked up and took off, even within the Roosevelt administration, people who expressed concerns like, Attorney General Francis Biddle, where they sort of backed down in the face of the War Department, the other arguments. I think the biggest effect they had, one was to elicit this, to try to elicit better treatment. Obviously the conditions were absolutely horrendous, initially, and they somewhat improved. But to encourage people to do things like to be the teachers or nurses or other things. I think where the biggest effect started happening was when these loyalty questionnaires were put. And that was sort of the big part. Right? The loyalty questionnaire is so controversial today, and we think of it as this terrible thing. But at the time, it was supposedly, right, by the JCL and by these allies of Japanese Americans, supposed to be this opportunity to prove your loyalty and to get out of camp, right? And as was pointed out, for some, it really was just about civil rights, civil liberties. But for others, it was entirely connected to this kind of paternalistic discourse of, we're going to purge these Nisei of their Japanese backwards traits so that they will now have the opportunity to assimilate into, mainstream white American society. And there was a really profound effect, right? So the people that stayed in places like Detroit were the ones that actually really didn't want to live back in a Little Tokyo or a Japanese American, rural community. Again, I mean, even people like, I was reading a quote that I had written down from Larry Tajiri, who was one of the most kind of progressive JACL leaders at that time. He said, like, at that moment, right as the war was ending, we need to eliminate Little Tokyos and make sure they never exist again. So I think on the one hand, the allyship was really important to giving people that opportunity to prove their loyalty and to leave camp, go to college, get jobs. But in many cases, it was tied to this very explicit, I mean, you can look at the pamphlets that the sort of Friends of Japanese Americans were putting out, and it says, like, don't talk Japanese. It's not just the government saying, like, if you want to prove your loyalty, do this. It's the allies who are funding these scholarships and things also saying, like, for your own good, don't talk Japanese, don't raise your kids around other Japanese people, don't live in a Japanese American community. And that had a really strong effect. And that was also at root of why there were some Japanese Americans who resisted these so-called interracial integration efforts that I talked about, because they saw it as a very kind of paternalistic, forced thing that was taking control and autonomy and culture away from them, right? So there was the issue of the Union Church. There's the issue of what would happen here. There was a big struggle over the YMCA, I think, in the Evergreen, Boyle Heights area. There was a big struggle over the Japanese Christian Church, which becomes an integrated, what they called an integrated church during World War II. So there's these really complicated stories, and yeah, I think it's all bound up in this shift away from a very racist, period of time to a moment when anti-racism is becoming a thing, but it's still very much for policymakers and sort of elites, this kind of top-down paternalistic discourse. That's why I sort of had to find these individual voices at the grassroots community level to see how it was playing out differently.
Good morning. My name is Nancy Oda, and I want to thank Duncan and both of you for such a wonderful morning. But I'm so thrilled to hear about the mayor, because he has this wonderful tribute down the street, and we at Tuna Canyon have been researching him, and I think that, I don't want to say this, but I will, I think he did really very unfair things to my community. Having said that, I wanted to say to Kimiko, Mayor Boren used the radio once a week, and we have a president who uses tweets every day. And so I'm counting on you on these 10-minute clips to tell the story to the new generation. Some people go, oh, I don't have a full-length movie. These are only 10 minutes, but they're powerful. And I think that they would listen to that. I was thinking about what your topic was about school. My sisters did not go to school that much when they were in Tule Lake, and they were sick. But I have heard that the Tule Lake camp was actually one of the best educational institutions, because they also had a strong Japanese language connection, as you might know, because many of them were going to return to Japan. I went to Marino School, which is just down the street here. And although some people think of education as being Japanese, not being Japanese, at Marino, we were encouraged to be good Japanese, to speak Japanese, read and write, and also Latin, so that we could compete in good schools, because Latin is the root of most vocabulary. So I enjoyed your point on some of the new words I jotted down. I appreciate that very much. And one thing that I'd like to say, because I know we have a diverse audience here, that my family left for camp and left the house in the hands of the Gomez family that lived with us for several years after we returned, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. So today, about the teachers and the people that held the space for us and who remain our friends, we thank them. But one thing that touched me most was you said power over or power with. And I'd like to end with never again is now. Thank you.
You know what? Maybe with that, what can you say after Nancy makes a statement like that? I want to thank our two presenters for the morning, Kimiko Marr, Scott Kurashige. I think they've set up us up for a really good day of conversation and discussion about these issues. And so let's take our lunch break and come back. We do have a whole afternoon of programs, film, speakers, and discussion. So please help me thank our morning speakers, Scott and Kimiko.